Thank you. Please proceed.
Okay, so good morning, everybody, and thank you for allowing me to be in this space today. I want to start off by saying that I want to emphasize my discomfort in relying on an example of a man that has not experienced trauma from police violence as an example of what we should be using as police standards. I believe that the community that's the most impacted should lead this. But he did say some good things, so I will address some of the statements that he made. The second thing that I want to state too is that I am an abolitionist, and while I'm aware that this system is not going to change overnight, and we do need to have reforms that are in place, and it's hard to breathe with this on. The reforms need to lean into community. And so when I say that, I mean they need to put community on a pedestal. They need to have community overseeing everything, and they need to be, the community needs to be leading in the determinant factor. These are the kind of reforms that are going to actually make the changes that we need. Now, in response to the policing principles by Sir Robert Peel, I'm going to provide more context on behalf of the most impacted in regards to the state of policing as it is today. Relationships between local law enforcement and our elected officials. So we have checks and balances put in place in order to make sure that our police are held accountable, but it's very problematic when you have, for example, a sheriff and a DA that are friends, going to barbecues and doing things outside of work together, building relationships and being beholden to each other. There's no accountability that can be had when relationships are built like that. Another example would be the city manager and a police chief. So those are examples of relationships between law enforcement and its checks and balances that are not helpful to getting accountability. Also, policies and legislation that does not include repercussions attached to them. So we've had a lot of good bills come out. We've had a lot of policy changes here locally in Sacramento. But if they're not including any type of repercussion or accountability inside of those policies, then they're violated and there's nothing that happens. We've seen everything that's come forth since I've been doing this work get violated, and there's never any repercussions. And the community needs to see the repercussions. The community needs to, in order to build this trust that we're talking about building between law enforcement and our communities, we need to be able to see the accountability piece. Also, vetting officers for involvement with white nationalist groups and or militias. I personally know 2 officers in the Sacramento Police Department that are associated with white supremacist groups. One has an 88 tattooed on his hand with the diamond tips, which stands for, it's a Heil Hitler tattoo. And then the other has used language called our allies race traitors. So if we're not having a process to vet our officers on their involvement with white supremacist, either culture or organizations, then we're failing, because it's attractive to those types to be in law enforcement and to have the power to kill Black people and not be held accountable for it. Also, the mentality of law enforcement that they're at war with the people. They're taking the sentiment to the streets when they're coming to our protest or coming to our marches where we're exercising our First Amendment rights. They're shooting our children in the face with rubber bullets. They're shooting our folks in the head with rubber bullets. Over this last couple months, we had 3 major injuries at the hands of law enforcement. One was a 13-year-old that was shot in his face, and he broke his cheekbone with a rubber bullet. And I just want to emphasize the fact that it seems like all of these incidents are officers aiming at the face and the head of people with bullets that they think are less lethal forms of force, but they can become lethal in that way. The second was a Sacramento resident that was shot 6 times in the head with rubber bullets, having had a fractured skull and had to have surgery. And then lastly, at one of our protests, a teenage girl was shot in her eye, and she's no longer able to see out of her eye for the rest of her life. So this is the kind of violence that we're facing when we're actually protesting the violence that we've been facing. We're being met with the exact same violence that we're trying to stop having happen. And I also want to emphasize the fact that there have been protests for folks that support Donald Trump on a weekly basis, and they are not met with that same violence. So there's definitely a racial bias. When it comes to, white folks going up to the Capitol and acting violent toward community, there is no National Guard being called. There is no rubber bullets being shot. There is no helicopters. There is no violence from law enforcement. So I just wanted to emphasize that as well. Also, units like, and every police department has these, but like the gang task or gang enforcement teams, gang task units, teams like POP units, problem-oriented policing units. These units they specifically and intentionally go into Black and brown communities to specifically and intentionally racially profile people based on things like hairstyles and clothing choices, things that aren't necessarily particular to gang members or even to Black and brown people. And there's a lot of violence in our community that isn't connected to the activists, the violence in the activist community, but there's a lot of violence in our Black and brown communities because of these teams and their authority and their power and their lack of any type of connection to these communities. They don't live in these communities, they don't care about these people, they don't look like the people that they're policing, and so that has got to be something that is reformed. Also, we see a lot of procrastination, and it seems very intentional by local elected officials, procrastination in getting any type of resolution. And the procrastination comes in the form of communicating with each other. Let's talk about this, let's have public input, and then we give the public input and then no changes are made. Or we get promises and they're not followed by changes. Or we get, performative type of reactions to what's going on in the world, and then we get promises after that and there are no changes. We've got mayors and other elected officials going into Black communities and going to Black churches and kneeling with Black people, and then they're not doing anything after that. And then that night, somebody may get shot in the face with a rubber bullet. So those are the types. I don't know what reform could be put in place for that, but there needs to be accountability on every single level in this state that kills the most people by law enforcement.
You have 1 minute.
1 minute? Okay.
Yes, thank you.
Okay. So the police will continue to murder us as a first resort as long as they are not being punished for their actions. We've danced around every suggestion, but for some reason intentionally avoid the one thing that will stop this all, and that's any type of punishment for the actions. Just like a civilian, if they killed somebody and it was wrongful, then there would be a punishment. A lot of times you hear people saying get rid of the unions, and that is something that's necessary. We will still have internal relationships that will conflict with that. A lot of people are saying, or I'm saying right now, we should limit internal relationships as necessary. But even in doing that, we'll still need policies that have repercussions included. A lot of folks will say that diversity and training is necessary to fix these problems. And I'd like to lastly quote a member of our group. His name is Victor Brazelton, and one of the demands that we gave to our mayor is that a commission should no longer be used as a tool of the police department to seek diversity to policing when we know that this is policing itself that is the issue. Community members getting murdered by Black police officers is not the answer that the community is looking for. And then lastly, I know that we have a new appointment of an attorney general that's gonna happen soon by the governor. I'd like to emphasize that we need to have somebody put in that position that works hard and stands for accountability of our police departments and law enforcement agencies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Faison, for your testimony and your powerful voice for the community. We really, really appreciate that. Again, members, just wanted to, this was setting the stage. That's why these individuals from the community